Training is strategic, and it impacts your bottom line. Businesses need to train their customers to build loyalty, sales and partners teams to accelerate growth, and workforce to drive innovation. What if you could use a single platform to build learning experiences for customers, partners, and employees alike? Introducing Adobe Learning Manager, a perfect enterprise-ready platform that is built to scale. Make learning an experience.
Hello, and welcome back to today's Training Industry Leader Talk, Engaging the Disengaged, sponsored by Adobe, Edstudia, ELB Learning, and Mind Tools for Business. I'm Dee Caraglino, your event producer and host today. Before we dive into the next session, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's session. Throughout the event, please feel free to put your comments into the chat window and submit your questions via the Q&A window. I will be monitoring your comments and saving your questions for Q&A toward the end of the session. I've enabled closed captions for this event, and you can select to turn those on or off by locating the closed caption icon in your toolbar. We encourage you to share the information you received today on social media. Follow us so that we're able to track your contribution to the conversation. At the end of your time with us, you'll notice a short survey pop open in your browser, and we'd appreciate your thoughts on today's event. Lastly, all of these sessions are being recorded and being archived on trainingindustry.com. You'll receive a follow-up email from us with a link to your on-demand sessions and materials. If this is your first Training Industry event, we'd like to welcome you. Training Industry exists to make connections among learning and development professionals. We offer tons of resources to support your role in L&D through live events like today's Leader Talk, as well as through articles on our website, our magazine, conferences, research reports, and our podcast. Make Training Industry your go-to resource for learning solutions and visit trainingindustry.com to learn more. And now I would like to introduce you to Dr. Alan Partridge. He is the Director of Evangelism at Adobe with over 20 years of experience in e-learning, education, games, and multimedia development. He has researched and reported on authentic learning solutions for audiences around the world for the past decade. Alan is recognized for his many online video tutorials and e-seminars, which are a mainstay for e-learning developers and trainers looking to create and deploy effective learning materials. And he has promised me that this session is going to be fun. So welcome, Alan.
Thanks so much, Dee, and thanks to everyone for joining today. It is fantastic to be here as always. Thanks to all the good folks at Training Industry as well for putting these together and making them possible. Yeah, and I think it should be fun. It should be all kinds of fun. I have all new material today, and I'm excited to be able to share and present that material for everyone. It should be an interesting topic to dive into. I hope that you will feel free to utilize the chat, carry on conversations that are on topic as we go along, because as I always point out, the wealth of information in any of these sessions is really coming from everyone cumulatively, because all together we have more knowledge than any one of us could ever possess. So I hope that you will feel free to share in the chat, talk about your own experiences, share your own ideas. And with that, let me dive in and tell you a little bit about how to stimulate learner curiosity with individualized learning approaches. I'm so excited about this topic. And I should say, as I get started, that as usual, I have the assistance of the wonderful folks at Adobe, including Tanisto Ghosh, who helps me with building out all of this content. So it's always great to have Tony on board. Big thanks to Tony. All right, so to kick things off, we thought, this Thomas Friedman quote is particularly relevant. That ultimately, it does beg us to consider what the world of digital means for each and every one of us. And I love this notion that, in fact, that progress and that a future comes when we have the capability to invent and reinvent, because it's all about that capability to solve problems creatively and to be able to adjust on the fly and be able to think in different ways and new ways. And that's really what today's topic is all about when we dive in Now, I'm going to be sharing with you a number of research projects today, some articles, some deeper research studies, some articles with research study links. You'll always find those articles at the bottom of the slide with links to them, and I believe we're sharing the slide deck with you guys at the end in case you aren't able to jump to them. But this particular one is starting with an article from Utopia, Why Curiosity Enhances Learning. This article drills in on several different studies that actually investigate the notion of curiosity from a brain cognitive kind of perspective. Now, this is interesting. So 2014, researchers from University of California, specifically California Davis, did a series of experiments to find that curiosity prepares the brain for learning and makes subsequent learning more rewarding. Now, that sounds like a very theoretical point and not so much a hard research point, but it's interesting. They put some empirical science behind it. Two thoughts on this. One, any of you who have taught actively or been instructors probably already have very strong inclinations that conform to this idea, right? That students are more activated when we find a way to activate their curiosity. Or if you've done any investigation into things like discovery-based learning, you might have noticed that that clear pattern exists where you can create a kind of problem or a challenge for learners. And by giving them a clear challenge, one that's not immediately solvable, it will activate something in them that causes them to engage and dive in more deeply. Think about this on a very simple level. If someone asks you a math question, what is 3 times 5? It only takes you a moment to do the math in your head and resolve it. But even then, you can kind of tell that your mind is engaged and almost can't avoid the desire to fill in the blank. So if I give you that problem and then I give you a blank, your mind almost needs to answer it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody was like fighting off or an urge to put the answer in the chat or had already done so. But that kind of engagement of curiosity, while it's the same category that the researchers found through their fMRI studies, it is not all of the story, right? So what we've found from these scientific investigations is that by looking at the hippocampus specifically and fMRI images of the hippocampus, scientists were able to understand that something is lighting up, especially when a challenge is presented which can't be resolved in a short time or which isn't automatically resolved for the learner in an immediate sense, right? So a problem that activates their curiosity and makes them start to think about or work actively on that problem, and especially one which is going to take some time and energy, some thought, maybe some communication, maybe some research, investigation, little hypothesis, some experimentation. That kind of activation is going to trigger a very strong reaction in the brain. And that strong reaction means a lot of things are firing all the way up to dopamine firing and getting the brain into an aroused or an excited state. So this is a particularly fascinating study, even though on the surface you might be thinking, oh, this is kind of a duh study, right? Like we kind of already know this. But what's interesting about it is that it confirms through actual hard science that actually there is evidence that the brain is getting activated when that moment of curiosity exists. And the authors, both of the article and of the studies, are starting to define for us what else might be required. Is it going to work with just a little, quick question and response, or is it going to take something deeper? Those of you who think about things like Socratic method or who wonder why I'm constantly asking you questions when I'm doing these presentations, you obviously maybe have thought about, oh, well, he's actually trying to trigger additional thought or interest in the moment. it's particularly challenging to do in this kind of context when it's a sort of lecture presentation mode, because the more the instructor encourages you to think independently, the more likely your mind is to wander elsewhere and shift off the materials at hand. So when you utilize these techniques and strategies and how you utilize them is going to be critically important. But what is absolutely confirmed here is that the brain gets aroused or excited, as the researchers say, aroused, then it is going to go through a period of heightened openness or receptivity to being able to learn and retain the information which is subsequently offered. That, interestingly, that doesn't have to be limited to just the information that is related to the problem or challenge. It's any and all information in the wake of that activated brain, which is going to be learned at a more rapid pace, at a deeper level. It's going to be retained more effectively. Now, part of this obviously is that the learner is actively manipulating the ideas and concepts in the wake of that kind of challenge trigger. But researchers also found that they could activate the brain in general using these methods. In fact, the author of this particular article, who, as I recall, was Francesca Gina, summarizes their own research and then describes their own study in this particular article. And in it, Gina points out that they were able to do a study which had a control group and a variable group. And in the variable group, they triggered the variable group by asking questions designed to activate a more creative behavior in the workplace. So questions like, have you asked yourself why something is the way it is at work today? Can you investigate more deeply a challenge or problem that comes up in the workplace, and so on? And they asked the control group a series of questions which were more about, what do you plan to do today? Things that were much more aligned to their specific expectations and their work tasks. They found that the variable group was really substantially more likely to report at the end of the work week having a much more productive work experience, where they had contributed much more creatively and much better ideas and inputs to the group as a whole. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. Why is this really all that important? And if you haven't endured me before, you may not realize that I'm probably never going to read the active slide, right? So when you see a slide like this one, I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to encourage you to read it while I'm working through, and because I know that you guys can multitask that, no problem. But what's interesting about Gina's research and the research of others who were in this article is that they consistently found that the organizations who had more significant openness in culture to curiosity among the workforce were performing significantly better on a variety of axes, not just performing better in the sense of innovation within the organization, but performing better as in they found that it reduced workplace conflict, it lowered tension, it caused people to be happier in general at their roles. And so there were all these very positive side effects of enhanced or increased curiosity and aroused curiosity for employees inside of the workspace, which makes for a really interesting kind of outcome. All of this from the article in the Harvard Business Review, a survey of more than 3,000 employees, 92% of them credited curious people bringing new ideas in teams and organizations. And the overall results were really clear. Now, so, okay, well, then it's a gimme, right? And business leaders should just encourage curiosity. Hang on a second and ask yourself, is that what you've experienced in your role? throw some thoughts in the chat there. But I know what I experience is often if I spend a lot of time ruminating or being curious about a process or thinking deeply about the way things are done and then bringing that back up to teams, I get as much positive feedback as I do negative feedback, right? And often that negative feedback comes in a form that's sort of suspicious about it, or sort of treats it as, are you sure that you don't have better things to be doing? Or even sometimes hostility toward new ideas and new concepts. The research says that in fact, workplaces are much better off to encourage and stimulate ongoing curiosity this way, but that from the top on down, it is also extremely likely that employees will face some challenges here. They'll face some hostility and other kinds of conflicts as they try to make those statements and adjustments to the workforce in general. So when we look at this, we can think of this as in this context. How then does learning really bolster curiosity? If we think about it, framing the work around learning goals rather than just performance goals can boost motivation. And that's really the summary of that initial set of studies. We talked about that series of text messages that Gino sent out and how the control group versus the variable group showed very differing reports and results. Now, when we look at that in reflection, after 4 weeks, the participants in the first group, that's the group that was the variable group, they had a different set of outcomes, right? So the participants in the first group scored higher than the others on questions that assessed their innovative behaviors at work, such as whether they had made constructive suggestions for implementing solutions to pressing the organizational problems. So there definitely were clear outcomes and results which were showing benefits to the organization and to the business. And conversely, we know that the results of tamping down or preventing that kind of curiosity have a very obstructive outcome, right? They put people in a mindset that is also deactivating their brain. Let me give you some sense of what I mean there. So when we think about the personalization as an option, and hang on with me as I sort of jump ship to the next piece. You'll remember when we started with the title, I talked about how you could actually leverage curiosity in order to improve and impact the overall results. And personalization is one of those levers, mechanisms that you can use to make this happen. So it was about 2008 when we saw personalization start to rise to popularity. And that is probably in part because there was a change in the technology that was able to support this kind of thing. But personalization is not new. Every teacher or instructor who's ever walked into a classroom understands that it helps a lot to learn your students' names. It helps even more to learn who they are and what their interests are. It helps even more to know a little bit more about them. And the more you know your students, the more likely they are to be open to you and receptive to you and receptive to your ideas. And more importantly, the more likely you are to bring to the attention of the learners ideas that are new for them and that are exciting and grab their interest. So personalization has existed for an age, but now in a world where most of the education that learners might get from a business sense or a corporate sense is online, it becomes a different kind of challenge. People have higher expectations that the online mechanisms will recognize them and will help filter and sort content for them in order to improve that availability of information. And so by focusing on the interests and needs of every individual, it is possible then to deliver learning solutions which are much more catered. Now think about that in the context of what we know about activating and triggering learners. And let's drive forward into the next kind of point here. So personalized learning drives the curiosity in the sense that it considers the learners as the center of the activity, and it harnesses their curiosity. It also appeals to the skills and interests of the learner and lets us build on top of that. It also delivers the instruction and the content based on the pace the learner is interested in receiving it, their consumption habits, their ability to own the learning as their own. And all of these things are about motivation, what motivates people to learn, and they're twisted up, tied up inside the notions behind personalization. When we take that to the next level, we can talk about the specific ways that it continues to drive their curiosity, and that can be kind of broken into two parts, right? So it can be one that the technology can drive that curiosity, and it can be two that personalized learning itself drives their curiosity. So when we're thinking about the technology, we often break it down, right? And we think of it in terms of recommendations that can be delivered to the learner in real time. We also often think of it in terms of content modality, the type of content that's actually being delivered to the learner. Like, is it a PowerPoint? Is it an e-learning interactive kind of experience? Is it a game? Is it a video? All of those kinds of things. We also think about it in terms of autonomy. Does the learner have control over that content and those pieces of learning material? And then finally, we think of it in terms of mastery. So I'm going to shift gears for a second and tell you, you may have heard me before talk about specifically about purpose, autonomy, and mastery as they relate to what motivates people. And that's a fairly clearly established paradigm about motivation that comes largely from the world of sports and sports training. But those concepts have easily worked their way into other literature and other research. And so there are other research formats that deliver some fairly parallel, if not exactly the same, kinds of frameworks that suggest why these factors are important to motivating people. Well, keep in mind that that sense of motivators, purpose, autonomy, and mastery, those are the things that feed into things like recommendations, which are on target for personalized learning, the modality availability so that people can decide when and what kind of content they want to use to learn, their sense of autonomy overall, and their sense of mastery. Now, when we think about mastery, what we're really thinking about is how well does a person believe that they now have mastered content, that they have mastered some area of knowledge or some set of skills or abilities. So each one of these things are critically important to helping learners kind of move through content effectively. And we can think of them as necessary requirements, but we also can break that down further and think about the scaffolding that builds that up, why that becomes important to people. So let's dive in just a little bit deeper and talk about DC and Ryan. So DC and Ryan wrote a book in 1985 called Self-Determination and Intrinsic Motivation in Human Behavior. Now, as usual, I love Tony, but he always gives me these charts which seem a little dense. So I'll apologize for the density of the chart, but I promise it's actually quite an interesting story that's being told here, right? So if we look at the spectrum of the specifics of self-determination theory, and there's a linked article here again on the bottom to give you some hints about self-determination theory. If we look at the self-determination theory spectrum for motivation, We have A motivation on the left, intrinsic motivation on the right, and then extrinsic motivation in the middle. Now, don't worry if you don't know what those are. That's the whole point of the SDT model here, right? A motivation, I want you to think of that learner who's become frustrated and is now belligerent, resistant to training, because for whatever reason they've tangled in their head, they feel like the content is unmasterable for them. Like they cannot overcome the content aspect, or in some cases, they feel like their ability to bond with others or recognize the purpose of why that content is important is a block for them. Like they don't care about their job, their workplace, their colleagues, their teams. And it's usually not that they don't care about other people, it's that they feel that others don't care about them. So if you really dive in on learners who feel amotivated, they're actually probably learners who feel like this company doesn't care about me, my unit doesn't care about me, my boss doesn't care about me, my team doesn't care about me. So why should I care about them? Why should I? Okay. Why should I would be a very common phrase among an amotivated kind of person, right? And once inside a kind of resistance to a block or an area of knowledge or training, it's quite a challenge actually to pull people out. Now, I should add, when you're thinking about motivation along the spectrum, one person can be motivated entirely differently toward one block or set or concept than they are to the next thing. And a person can change their motivation and where they sit on the spectrum from day to day, right? Because we're all human. Sometimes you're just amotivated because you don't care about the world, but it's because you just lost a family member, or you just had a serious tragedy in your life, or you just broke up with a loved one, right? And those things cause a person to fall into that amotivated state as well. And there's very little that we can do from a training perspective. Okay, so extrinsic motivation here is actually a deceptively large category in the specific model that DC and Ryan set forth. In DC and Ryan's model, there should be a little line from extrinsic motivation down to the second row of gray squares. Each of these, external regulation, introjection, identification, and integration, are actually different variants of extrinsic motivation. Now, I'm super watching the clock, and I'll tell you, intrinsic motivation is when a person is motivated based on their own desire to learn the content. Extrinsic motivation is in any case where a person is motivated by some outside force, right? So look at those four types. The external regulation model is when a person is motivated by things like gifts or rewards, and that those are subbing in. Now, none of these are necessarily bad, but it's good to be aware when that's what the actual motivation is. Introjected regulation is when a person is motivated by a kind of desire to win. They're a reward-seeking person. They feel guilty when they're not on the top of the list. So these are gamers. You know, they want to demonstrate their competence. And if their competence and autonomy desires are not satisfied, if they feel like they're not winning or leading, then they're going to kind of fall back into this zone of introjected regulation. Now, regulation through identification is when a person puts their actual identity into this notion, this ideal of what they are as a person. And because they imagine themselves as a good learner or a good employee, a model employee, they perform well, but they're still technically being motivated by something external. So if it got interrupted, if any aspect of that was interrupted, then they would fall back in that paradigm. And then finally, the integrated regulation is when a person is still kind of chasing an idea. In this case, it's an idea that learning is important, right? It's a little, I would call that a more noble idea, but still an idea which is external. So that satisfies the connection and competence needs, but it's still externally forming ideas like the importance of learning, and those are all external motivations. The perfect situation is when you can bring learners to the phase that they are intrinsically motivated. That and the indicators of that are that they love learning the stuff, that they're actively curious. Interesting that that word comes back into play again, right? And that they're fascinated by what the content is that they're actually digesting. That's when we start to get really hot, so to speak, in terms of the likelihood that they're going to be active and firing on all cylinders. You can think of this as running internal intrinsic motivation running in direct parallel to curiosity and building discovery-based kind of learning and challenges, where the learning is being actively kind of cultivated and grown from within based on information and ideas provided, but also based on the critical information that a person is building based on their own interest and desire to create that kind of content. So all of those things can contribute to creating a very effective paradigm where we're putting together a personalized learning approach, where we're understanding the motivation of the learners, and where, in a practical sense, we're trying to build the learners up by establishing avenues for them to be actively excited about the kind of content that's available and that they're learning and that they're mastering. Now, I want to mention just briefly that Adobe does, in fact, use these paradigms to build and extrapolate its learning management system, Adobe Learning Manager. And you can see those reflected in the way that the feature sets are ideated here. You can see experience, creating a community or a unified learning experience, engagement, using those mechanisms of gamification, social learning, and hybrid learning to engage the learners, all following the line of those kinds of steps of key motivation. Personalization through things like AI-based recommendations, personalized user dashboards, personalized interest campaigns, and then automation. These are effectively elements for convenience. And we'll just ignore that core platform because that's all about technology and security. So with that, I hear my little ringer has been going off for about 90 seconds. And I think that wraps us up with enough time for questions. Dee, do we have questions?
Yes, we do. Let me get those for you. Kim Sue would like to know if a person can flow back and forth between intrinsic, extrinsic, and amotivation.
They absolutely can. You nailed it. That's exactly what happens from day to day. Think of it as, envision this as a person who likes to garden, right? Now, gardening is a form of ongoing learning. You're teaching yourself at all times based on the experiences that you have, the feedback you're getting from the growth of the plants, and by reading articles and all that kind of thing. Now, some days you're going to feel absolutely like doing that activity. And other days, you just don't feel like it, right? And it could be that you love that thing, that you learn from it every chance you get. But for some reason, one day something's just not clicking, and you kind of fall back into an amotivated state, or you fall back into an externally motivated state because maybe you have a rule for yourself. Like, I may not feel like it, but every day I will garden because I'm a good gardener, right? And you can see how that sounds like, oh, wait a minute, that's a person who's motivated by an ideal, like an image of themselves as a good gardener. And that's an extrinsic form of motivation as opposed to intrinsic. And it could be that this person was intrinsically motivated 90% of the time, but one day they just don't quite feel like it. And then it could also happen that weeks later, something really serious happens and they fall all the way back to amotivated and they don't go anywhere near their gardening. Same kind of thing. This is the same way for tasks at work, for jobs, day-to-day. And the authors of these articles recommend that people stop what they're doing, take a break, take some deep breaths, maybe get a chance to go out for a walk, clear your mind, and then go back to the tasks in question. And I think that recommendation is quite solid because while you can function as a worker for quite some time as extrinsically motivated by ideals, you're definitely in trouble if your mind reaches a place where you're amotivated to contribute.
Yeah, that usually I find that's a sign that you're starting to get burned out and you probably need
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions?
Let's see. Joy says that she sometimes has trouble convincing stakeholders or participants that extrinsic introjected motivation is risky or unsuitable, e.g. introjection so associated with burnout. Do you have any suggestions to help explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's extremely risky because when we look at introjected, where often people are motivated by a desire to win or a desire to demonstrate their own superiority, and then there is always a bigger fish. That's Star Wars logic, right? There will always be a bigger fish that will come in and eat, right? So as soon as that happens, it's a person who is using their status or their establishment of high competency as their sole mechanism to motivate them is going to be devastated when a new person arrives who is better than them at the tasks. And it will be very hard for them to do sensible things like, wow, how are they better than me at that? I wonder if I can learn from that person. Instead of that, they're likely to shut down. So yeah, I think you're dead on right to tell people in your workplace that's a dangerous space to be in. It's potentially problematic. And solving these, what are effectively soft and psychological issues is not necessarily easy because people in the workplace are often sort of, well, especially the American workplace. Maybe it's not true all over the world, but it probably is. They sort of tend to say, well, belly up to the bar and get your grit out and all that kind of stuff, right? But the reality is that just leads to burnout. That just leads to an end result which is not productive, and it's very expensive to train new personnel. It's very expensive to have somebody have to take a major break, time off. All these things cost companies money, and if we can actively begin to try to bring people over to where they're actively curious, it can make a huge difference in terms of saving the organization from those kind of losses.
Okay. Joseph asks, what measures should an organization put in place so that individuals are brought into the broader team and gains achieved are incorporated to play out within the wider group?
That is an excellent question. I think that's one of the things that can happen as soon as we start communicating more effectively about learning. And as soon as as the Harvard Business Review article suggested, as soon as we make learning a priority, which stands almost side by side with our key performance indicators or our other kind of metrics that we're using to measure the effectiveness of the employee. Here's why I think that's so important. When we do that, we start to do things like say, you know what, actually, we've been nervous about starting social learning, but this is a reason to do that. Because once people are able to share ideas and content in the social learning space, they are actively learning from each other and they are actively reinventing the way that things are done. It's also very monitorable, so leaders can look at it and watch for any kind of deviations that are non-standard, like coming up with cheats or mechanisms to do things poorly, and instead recognize and appreciate those things which are clearly wins for the organization, and then further celebrate employees in that space. Same thing with gamification. It gives you a chance. Anytime you're doing something which is giving you a chance to recognize the growing mastery of the population, those reinforcements are going to be super helpful. But then they'll also give you the information and insights you need to think about, how can I get these folks to be more curious, lifelong learners about this field, as opposed to stuck in a rut, dealing with some kind of extrinsic motivation, or worse, amotivated inside my organization. It gets everybody from the top down talking about it, and it gives you a growing lattice work of information and ideas to draw from.
And I think one thing that, just sitting through all of our sessions today is the thing I'm taking away is that a lot of engagement has to do with connecting with your team, and that we need to make sure that those connections are happening so that people are learning from each other and, in a sense,
So
motivating
true.
each other.
So true, Dee. And I think that's one of the things that the DC research really points to clearly, that connectedness, in other models, they tend to talk about that as purpose, which I think is a way to make it less emotionally rooted. And we, as researchers and academics, we often just get terrified at the idea that something is affective order, or that it's behavioral in nature, that it's about the emotional core of people. That's such a shame, right? Because once we realize, oh wait, humans actually are meant to have emotions and have cores, and those emotions are going to come into play, then we can do a much better job of motivating each other, because DC argues this is about connectedness. It's about your sense. DC doesn't use the phrase love and belonging, but to me, that's how I translate it. It's a Maslow love and belonging. It's about belonging to a group, feeling accepted, feeling solid, having trust in your place in that unit. And that makes a huge difference in terms of how motivated you are.
Yes. I've been doing a lot with community building too, so it seems to be a very broadly applicable topic. Kim C would like to know if you have suggestions for fostering curiosity.
Absolutely. I think the best thing that you can do to foster curiosity is to have to encourage a culture which is open to it. So that means, from a top-down level, communicating with leaders the value that curiosity has in the workplace, so that when an employee comes to them and says, I have this idea to do ABC, right? That their immediate response is positive in nature, right? That it's fine to remind the employee if they have, sort of pending deadlines, et cetera, but cultivating or growing ideas that come from everywhere is a huge step. And it has to be something that the entire organization, leadership down, understands how to appreciate. Adobe is actually a great example of this. Adobe leadership is frequently saying things like, ideas come from everywhere at Adobe. And that's a root belief, right? So the core belief then is that any employee, no matter where they sit in the whole organization, could have a great idea that could benefit the bottom line of the organization in a huge, huge way. And that's a part of culture, right? So you maybe begin to put that into your overall messaging about the kind of behaviors and expectations that you have for people in the organization. Also, that notion of valuing learning, prioritizing it, so that people understand that time spent learning and researching and growing is time you're investing in your career. And then also just spending time, expecting to spend time validating the work. I also know that Microsoft and a couple of other large tech companies even take time off. Like, I think either one day a month or one day a week is devoted just to learning experiences. And that's becoming more and more common. So obviously, organizations are beginning to see that there's tremendous value here, and that value can be realized, and it can turn into revenue for the company, or optimization of losses, so that you reduce the losses.
Yeah, I think the hardest part is just making the time to build it into your company structure. So I think we have time for one more question. Amanda would like to know, how do you think AI will influence motivation?
I think AI is a delicate bunny, right? So here's the thing. People either don't understand AI and think that it's like Terminator coming to like attack us in warehouses, or they understand it and think that the name is probably a little inappropriate. So I'm in the camp of people who understand quite a bit about AI, and I think the name is way premature. Okay. So AI is not so much artificial intelligence today as it is workflow and process optimization through enhanced automation, and as it is the use of advanced mathematics to solve complex, repetitive motion kinds of problems. Now, that becomes harder to understand when you think about things like generative AI, where it's spitting out images and stuff like that. But if you really dig in, you'll realize that even generative AI for images has no intelligence. It doesn't know what anything is. It has tags which are associated with image sort of blobs and concepts that are very, very loose. And then those are used through an enormous, crazy number of mathematical filters to generate these results based on just massive, massive amounts of data, and based on the sort of set of averages to bring you to where you want to be. Even the Chat GPT, for example, is an averaging solution with no brain behind it. Okay. So when you ask Chat GPT to produce for you some kind of article, what you're going to get is the most averaged, sort of banal possible article, because it's at every junction, it's trying to attach words and phrases to topics and concepts that are the most likely to be attached. Therefore, all writing from such units will always be the most mediocre, the most middle of the road, and also has potential to be flawed. And the same thing with the images we've all seen, sort of generative AI images that have too many fingers and all that kind of thing. Well, it's because it doesn't know what a hand is and it doesn't know what fingers are. So it can't be much of a shock that it, can't generate the right number of fingers very consistently. So we are at a place right now where the AI is contributing most effectively, especially in large enterprise solutions, in optimizing workflows for things that people really don't want to do anyway, or that aren't getting done. So think translating 100,000 documents. That is a very cruel job to give a human being, but it's a reasonable job to give to AI. And then when it comes out the other end, a human will still have to do it. We look at a solution like Adobe Captivate, which is, demonstrated early versions of AI generative courses and course content. In every single tool inside of the demo for that, we have modeled it to have regeneration and override capacity, because inevitably the content that it presents you, I think, should be seen as a way to wipe away the white paper and give you some prompts. But then you're going to want to write it yourself in your own words. You're going to want to put in your own imagery. Maybe you accept the AI image generation, but maybe you generate 100 images before you come up with the one that you actually think is a good plan. So if you think about that, that's giving you a tool to get the image you want. It's giving you a tool to prompt you to talk about the topic. But in the end, you still have to do the research to validate it. You still have to do the writing to kind of, so I don't see this as a job killer. I actually see it as a job creator. I think it's going to be similar to all the technologies that came before it. And at least for another 5 to 10 years, it's not going to have actual, what they call generalized intelligence, which is what would be required to actually solve complex problems anywhere near what a human could. We're still a long way from that.
I think it could still serve as a motivational or engagement tool, in a sense that it helps you realize an idea. But
yeah, absolutely.
Definitely
anything
don't try to do it for you.
Yeah, anything that gets you percolating is a great plan.
Yeah. All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
No, it's fun as always. Thanks so much for joining. This is an interesting new topic. I hope you'll give some feedback generously. Feedback is a gift. This is a new topic, so I sure would love to hear your thoughts about these thoughts, and if you have ideas about ways that you're exploring curiosity, or if you have strong agreement or disagreement, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I love getting that kind of feedback, and I'm sure someone will ask me to present on this topic again, and it'll be even better if I've got your thoughts too.
What I love about the Leader Talks is just hearing from all of these people who are so smart about all of this,
Exactly.
our presenters and our attendees.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. So that brings us to the end of today's leader talk. I would like to thank Dr. Partridge and all of our dynamic speakers, and to our sponsors, Adobe, Studia, ELB Learning, and Mind Tools for Business. Just a reminder that all of today's sessions are pre-qualified for a credit hour by SHRM, HRCI, ISPI, and CPTM. And we would love to meet all of you in person in Raleigh, North Carolina at the 2024 Training Industry Conference and Expo. TICE is where learning leaders like you gather to forge new professional connections, learn from each other, and address your most pressing learning challenges. Re-energize your learning initiatives at TICE 2024. It's coming up in June. You can learn more at tice2024.com. And you can, what better way to tackle engagement than by taking things a step further with Training Industry's Agile certification for HR and L&D professionals. You can learn to make Agile transformation a priority in your organization, embrace a growth mindset to encourage a strong learning culture while learning to innovate and align recruiting and onboarding processes. And you can start your journey today and register with ease at trainingindustry.com/agile for an upcoming virtual session. One last reminder, a survey will pop open in your browser when you exit. Please give us your feedback on today's session. Thank you for joining us, and please join us for the next Training Industry Leader Talk. I'm Dee Caraglina. Until next time, have a great day.